We are starting our audit committee meeting. And Dr. McKenna or Mr. Materski, do you want to start us off?
I will turn this over to Mr. Materski for this particular meeting at this time.
Okay, thanks, Dr. McKenna. This is our annual required audit committee meeting where the audit committee receives the draft audit from our auditor, Gresham Malecki, being represented tonight by Carl Whitmer. What I'd like to do at this point is just to turn everything over to Carl so he may provide you the audit information and answer any questions you may have.
Great, thank you.
All right, thank you for the introduction, Tom. Again, my name is Carl Whitmer. I'm the partner at Gresham Malecki, assigned to the Williamsville Schools audit. I've been on this engagement for several years now. I think I've met everyone at the table, most recently John. It was nice to meet you tonight. And here tonight to go over the results of the audit for the fiscal year ended June 30th, 2020. So we have met with management on several occasions throughout the audit and also circulated a set of draft financial statements last week. Tonight, we're coming prepared with a short slideshow just to try to summarize the audit process and also capture some of the macro perspective of the financial highlights on the district's general fund. So if you would follow along in the slideshow, first page. There we go. First off is quickly the products of our audit, what you can expect at the end of our engagement each year. The first being the obvious one, your basic financial statements. So that's your package of the district's, all the fund activity, all the balances at June 30th, 2020 of all your assets, your liabilities, and your fund balances, and also the revenue and the expenditure activity for the 12 months therein. The financial statements, they are the responsibility of the district. They're the ownership of the district. Where we come in as the auditors is put our opinion on those financial statements. And why that's important is so that users or readers of the district's financial statements, those are compiled and managed by Tom and his staff throughout the course of the year. But a reader of the financial statements looks to us as the external auditors to provide that third-party assurance that the numbers that are included in that book can be relied upon as accurate and fairly stated. So that's our role. In those basic financial statements will also be a separate section called the single audit. At the back of the basic financial statements is the single audit, and that represents the district's federal compliance audit. So once an entity receives and spends over $750,000 of federal awards, you're subject to a compliance audit called the single audit. So Gresham Malecki essentially acts as an extension of the federal government and performs a compliance audit over those particular funds to see that they were handled properly. There's a handful of different programs that represent that federal money. This year, the special education cluster was the major program that was selected for testing. There's a rotation to things, and that was the program that was selected. In addition to the financial statements is a management letter. Here is our opportunity to provide our observations and maybe some best practices to the district that perhaps we've seen elsewhere and we think would fit the district or would improve. Also, if there are any issues or findings, we would include it in the management letter. The auditor communications letter essentially goes through the technicalities and the responsibilities of the two parties in this engagement. So we're hired to perform the audit. We have certain responsibilities, being the owners and the authors of the financial statements and the records. Management and the district has your responsibilities. This letter essentially reviews those responsibilities and makes sure both sides held up their end for a successful audit. And we did have a successful audit. Finally is an extra classroom activity report. This is a smaller, separate cash basis financial statement just on the activity of the various clubs and programs throughout the district. This financial statement is put together under the guidance of New York State Education. getting into, are there any questions on the process of the audit itself? Try to give a summary there, but if not, we'll move into the financial highlights. So this first slide is going to present the last 5 years of revenue and expenditure activity for the district's general fund. And what you can see is your blue line, or your revenues, has been rather predictable or steady with a constant small increase, marginal increases each year. And that's typical of many school districts. But on the other hand, your red, or your spending, is a little bit more difficult to budget or to predict. Most recently, your 2019-20 fiscal year is a perfect example. Something like COVID comes into play, and everything that you plan for sort of goes to the wayside, and you just need to adapt to what's going on. In the case of the district, the revenues increased about $4 million from last year. Total revenues on that blue line are about $189 million. That increase of $4 million is just about a 2% increase from the prior year. So $4 million, it sounds like a lot, but when you look at the size of the budget of this school district, you know, just a 2% increase. The increases there came primarily from the budgeted and anticipated property tax levy. And also there was about $1 million windfall from the sale of school buses. On the expenditure side, it actually went down $10 million from last year, from $185 million down to $175 million. And that's just about a 5% decrease in spending. Outside of the contracted increases tied to salaries and all the instruction costs that were, you know, essentially once you sign up and enter into contracts, you're going to be paying that amount. Outside of those, you experience savings in several areas. The first being transportation. Obviously, the buses weren't being run for those months. On the benefits side, you experienced a good year with fewer health insurance claims. That saved several $1 million compared to prior years. And finally, the amount that the general fund contributed towards capital projects was almost $5 million less than the previous year. So this year was just about 9 or 10 million, whereas last year was 15. Large investment in capital last year. When you consider those revenues of about 189 million coming in over expenditures of 175 million, that net surplus or increase to fund balance was just over $14 million for the year. Now, when we take a look at that $14 million, here we present a bar graph of the fund balance levels, and this is basically your equity portion on your balance sheet. So in that 2018-19, last year we were at $73.5 million in total. Add that $14 million of increased fund balance from the current year operations, you're going to arrive at that $88 million number at June 30th, 2020. Now this slide further segregates fund balances into two separate areas based on how available or how restricted those funds are to the district for spending. $68 million, that red portion, represents restricted fund balance. There are several different reserves within there. But as you can see from last year, that went up 11, almost $12 million compared to last year. So $11.5 million of the current year savings or surplus was allocated to these reserves to fund those reserves. The largest increase in the reserves was in the capital projects reserve, which went up $8.5 million. There was also just about roughly $1 million increases in the workers' compensation reserve, as well as the retirement contributions reserve. That takes care of $11.5 million of that current year increase. And now you say, where did the remaining roughly $3 million go? That's in the blue portion here. So you can see that went from 16.9 million up to 19.9. We're going to refer to that as the unrestricted fund balance. And it's further broken down, that $19 million number on the next slide, into unassigned fund balance and assigned fund balance. That $3 million funded the current year's assigned fund balance. And really what this represents, the red portion of $12 million, is representing two items. One, the amount of fund balance that was appropriated when putting together the fiscal year 2021 budget to close the gap and balance the budget. That was just over $5 million. In addition to that, there are amounts which represent commitments by the district made during the June 30th, 2020 fiscal year towards future purchases, and those are called encumbrances. Those were up to $6.4 million this year. We have had discussions with management, and I believe also with the audit committee at the onset of the audit regarding these amounts. In particular, there were two larger ones, one related to the transportation contract and them seeking payment, but also there was an amount which was based on management's anticipated spending related to the new spending requirements or challenges brought on by COVID. And that was almost $2.5 million. So you can see why those amounts increased at the end of June 30, 2020. Your blue portion, or your unassigned, the available fund balance, maintained very closely with last year and came in right at that 4%. So when you see on the next slide here, the district is subject to New York State Real Property Tax Law, Section 1318, and it's casually called the 4% rule. Essentially, they want to see certain category of fund balance, and for the district it ends up being the unassigned fund balance, shouldn't exceed 4% of the next year's budgeted appropriations. This $7.9 million of unassigned fund balance at June 30th, 2020, as it's reported by management financial statements, comes in right at that 4%. That's without getting into the real nitty-gritty and flipping through the full financial statements. Those are some of the high-level financial highlights that we wanted to cover tonight. But overall, I'd say the audit ran very smooth. I mean, all things considered, everyone was thrown, left or right, unexpectedly. Lots of meetings to attend, whether it be in person or virtually. We were able to come in and still perform audit work on site in a comfortable and safe environment. We made sure both the district was comfortable. We made sure our staff also felt comfortable in the environment. We're able to maintain social distancing and mask up when necessary. So we're able to complete the audit, in the normal timetable that we have in previous years, which I think is really something to commend everybody at the district on the extra effort and cooperation that it took to complete that. So that was a big positive this year. Related to that encumbrance of $2.5 million, it is out of a unique circumstance that was booked as an encumbrance this year. It's not a typical encumbrance. Typically, an encumbrance is supported or tied to a specific purchase order or real commitment of a particular good or service. So as a result of this encumbrance not fitting that structure, there will be a finding in the back of our report about that, because that supporting documentation didn't exist for this amount. It was something that the district anticipated in spending. So that will be in the back of the financials. The management letter, we have no new findings to share. The only item that we'll have in there relates to the new Governmental Accounting Standards Board, which is GASB. They issued pronouncements on how the financial statement should be put together. All issued but not yet implemented GASB statements are put in this letter basically as an FYI to the district for what's on the horizon. We are here to help out management implement the requirements of those statements every year. Outside of that, we received full cooperation, which was great. We really didn't know what to expect this year in audit season. It was really, really impressive that everything was able to go according to plan. And we are in a position to release financial statements upon approval by the board. The financial statements, Mr. Matursky should be submitting by the end of day on October 15th to meet a deadline with New York State Ed. And we don't anticipate any problems by meeting the deadline this year. So thank you for your time. And if there are any questions at all, I'd be happy to answer. Sean?
Yeah, I just had one actually, and you already answered 99% of it. I had made a note here about that encumbrances notation at the end of it. Are we going to document these, or at least have some sort of a management response to basically spell out what he's already said, that the reason for it was because of, you know?
Yeah, if you go back to our pre-audit engagement meeting, I provided a memo at that point to Drescher and Malecki, and I shared it with all of you. And what we'll be doing is I have drafted already a response that will go with the corrective action plan. And essentially, within my response, I state a number of things. First of all, I think you have to look at the uniqueness of the situation. We were still in May. The economy was still locked down. We had no direction from New York State on whether or not we'd be opening school at all, and what that opening school model would look like. So at the time, we knew we would be needing expenses. We also knew supply chains were rather difficult. So we put that together in an effort that was really saving money from what you saw on that one slide that showed our expenses decreasing. And we used those dollars as actually you may recall, if you go back to our September meeting, the budget transfer I did was those dollars that actually were encumbered, and they were used to purchase the laptop. So the entire amount has already been expensed and paid, and I think that although we went through kind of a non-normal way to do that, it really has worked out for us as far as a financial way to fund those items for the district. But yes, we will be doing that.
Sure, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't have any other questions.
No, I'm good. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Carl, for being here. This concludes our audit committee meeting.